G'day and welcome to another video with Better Pics. Hope this finds you all well. Today I want to look at showing you a little bit about a couple of settings that are available within Photoshop. In fact, these settings are available within Adobe Camera Raw and Adobe Lightroom as well. But we're just looking at them in Photoshop because this is the platform that a lot of people use. And it's looking at ways to make colors a little bit more intense. So if you find that the intensity of colors in your images are lacking a little bit, then there's a couple of options of what you can do to increase that intensity. And those settings are Vibrance and Saturation, and they're generally speaking fairly well known within Photoshop and Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw, but they handle color a little bit differently. So we just want to look at what that means, how that works, and some suggestions or ideas around what the best way to go is. So we've got a couple of images here. This image I photographed in Alaska, and it was I thought it was an interesting contrast with the red and white power line support contrasted with such a beautiful natural environment. And this is actually from my hometown in Brisbane in Australia. So the Story Bridge with the sun going down at sunset, looking across the water towards the bridge with the city in the background. So two very different images that will be interesting to see how they respond to these settings. All right, let's start with the image in Alaska. We're just going to open up our options box over on the right hand side here, and you'll see that we have open the adjustments panel. Now if you can't see that, if you just pop up to window and go down and make sure your adjustments are ticked, then that window will appear. Basically what this does is this allows us to apply an adjustment layer on top of the image, so it gives us full non-destructive editing options, which is always a good thing. Now you can see if we have a look on that panel, it just says there to add an adjustment. We've got a whole bunch of different adjustment options, and what we're looking for is the Vibrance and Saturation, which is this actual triangle. It's only called Vibrance, but it does have the option for Saturation up on the top right hand corner. So if we click on that, we can see that we've had a Vibrance layer applied above the image. If we look in our Layers panel, again, if you don't see Layers, just head up to Window and pop down to Layers. There we go. You can see it's ticked, which is why we are able to see it. Excellent. All right. So you can see with that adjustment layer, we have the option of Vibrance or Saturation. Now, Vibrance and Saturation, while on the surface they aim to achieve the same thing, they do it in a different way. If we have a look at Vibrance first, what Vibrance does through algorithms that are built into Photoshop, it aims to lift the intensity of the colors that it deems to not be intense to begin with. So for example, in this image that we're looking at, we can see that the red in the power pole is quite an intense color, but to my eye, the green in the forest in the background is lacking a little bit. So this is a situation where Vibrance, in theory, will apply some more color intensity to the green of the forest, but not necessarily to the red in that set of poles that are holding up the power lines there. As opposed to Saturation, which applies equal color intensity increase right across the image regardless. So that's the main difference. Vibrance is working to, I guess, balance the intensity of color across the image by taking into account the different intensities of color that would normally exist in the image anyway, whereas Vibrance is just a simple across-the-board application or adjustment that is applied to the image equally across all of them. So if we go to Saturation, and I'm going to go up to 100%, which is quite extreme, but just to show exactly what that looks like, if we increase that color, we can see that the intensity of the green is way beyond what I would normally do, but again, for demonstration purposes, you can see that that's increased the color, but also the red on the pole as well. So if we just click and drag that back to 0, or we can enter 0 into that little dialog box, that takes us back to where we started. Whereas if we go down to the Vibrance, if we increase that one to 100, you can see that the color of the forest has increased significantly again, but the orange or the red on that power pole hasn't actually increased much at all. And if we go up and back and up and back, you can see there's a little bit increase there, but not a great deal. So if we take the approach that we would in a normal editing situation, and I might just increase it up to around, let's say, plus 45, just roughly 46. You can see that as I mentioned, the color of the forest has increased in intensity. But the power poles there still look natural as they would in real life. They don't look too bright or too intense with color. So that's a really good example of how Vibrance works. As I mentioned, the algorithm looks for color that isn't as intense as it could be and tries to balance that across the image. Let's pop over to our image of Brisbane, and you can see there's a lot of color in this image, but you can see the color in the reds and the reflection off the bridge with the lighting there is quite intense already, whereas the blues and these purples in the sky and the reflection of that in the water is a little bit less intense, for want of better words. Let's go back to our Vibrance adjustment, and we'll click that, and again we can see the Vibrance and Saturation options there. If we increase that Vibrance, you can see that the reds are not really increasing that much, whereas the blues and purples in the sky and again the reflection on the water are increasing quite nicely. And I'm going to give that one a little bit more of a treatment, so up around plus 50, plus 55, plus 53, there we go. And you can see that the color intensity in that image has a better balance to it. It looks a little bit more balanced across all of those different colors that we can see. If we take that back to 0, again, if we just enter 0 into that little option box there, and we go over to saturation and we increase that up to 53 or in the 50s, you can see that the increase intensity in that color saturation or that color intensity in the reds, it's still not balanced because it's applied an increase in intensity right across the image. So while the blues and the purples have increased in intensity, the reds have as well, and they're now still overpowering the image. So let's just take that one back to 0, and let's go back to our Vibrance, and we can see that we can balance that really successfully again up into the low 50s, and that color looks really nicely balanced across the image. Now this is of course without any other adjustments being applied to the image. I've simply gone into the raw files and through Adobe Camera Raw opened up the image, or the images I should say, within Photoshop. Now they're both shot with different cameras as well. This image was shot with a 5D, I think it was a 5D Mark III, and this image was photographed with a Fuji camera. So yeah, very different cameras, but you can see that it is certainly both working in the same way, where Vibrance, again, looks at that algorithm of colors that it determines to be less intense, and it works to balance the image from a color intensity perspective, as opposed to saturation, which just increases that intensity across the board with no consideration for how the colors are appearing. So you can see those tools are really handy, and depending on your creative approach, as I've mentioned in previous videos, there's an endless number of ways that you can approach image making. And these are just two tools of many that are available to us to be able to work with our images and produce the images that we see and we want to produce. So of course, if saturation is the best tool for you to achieve an outlook or a look that you're going after, then absolutely go ahead. But just keep in mind that with those two different tools, Vibrance and Saturation, you will get different results. So depending on what you want to achieve, depends on the tool that you go for. Hope this video has been helpful. Thanks again for stopping by. As always, any questions, please pop them in the comments below. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks again, and take care.